Okay, so this week we're on question 2, specifically, can learners be a native-like in a second language? This brings up a lot of questions, such as what does it mean to be native-like, which is a really hard thing to define, and we'll kind of touch around the edges. But let's kind of, as our basis, assume that when I say become native-like, generally what I mean is I've given you some kind of test that tests part of a language and you perform exactly like a native speaker. So let's just start with that as a basis definition of what is native like, right? Because I think a lot of times we're imagining that when we use that word, right? To this case, we have 3 possible answers. One is obviously no, of course not. One is of course you can, and one is yes, but not in all domains at the same time. Right? So these are 3 positions that gets discussed in the book, which you should have read already. I prefer you go back and read it now, but if you must read it after, do it, okay? But do read, okay? So yes, but not in all domains at the same time, right? So when I say this, I'm talking about domains. I'm talking about things like syntax, morphology, phonology, phonetics, semantics, pragmatics, processing, honestly, right? So the idea would be that I could be completely native like in one of these and not in another, okay? So far the 3 positions are you can't be, you can be in all, presumably all, or you can only be in some at any given time, okay? This particular slide here asks for examples of what non-native like would look like in these areas. And the simplest one is phonology that we discussed actually in class on the 31st of August, which is phonology. Phonology is lots of cases, certainly at least of phonetics, probably phonology too, of people not becoming native-like. They have pronunciations of things or applications of phonological rules that don't match up with native speakers. This is why a lot of non-natives have accents, right? So that would be a case of being non-native like. If you have an accent, you are non-native like in phonology or phonetics, depending on what's causing you to have an quote accent. Okay? But we will talk, I'm going to ask you in class for examples of these other things. Okay? So let's talk about no. No, learners can't be native like. Now, people who believe this start citing certain studies, right? This is how claims get made and positions get defended in science is they go to other studies that have looked at this and who have concluded something and they say, well, they concluded it and I'm convinced, so this is what I think too, right? So someone who says no, learners can't be native like is looking at articles like Flegge et al. 98 that tested a bunch of learners and found that they did not have target-like phonology in the same sense we just discussed. They retain either phones you wouldn't expect or a mapping of phone you wouldn't expect, right? Someone who says, no, you can't be native like might cite Capetiers and Johnson Newport, 1989, 2 different articles, because the morphology was different, especially tense and aspect. Tense is, of course, things like past tense and future. Aspect has to do with the relationship between 2 points in time. So aspect is like I have done or was doing, right? Ongoing or proceeding, that kind of stuff. But the point is that the morphology gets used with less than 100% accuracy is what they would claim. Now, native speakers are not 100% either, but in these studies, they found that it was a larger gap than just, you know, the chance errors that natives can make sometimes. Someone who says that learners can't be native-like might also cite syntax with respect specifically to subjacency from Johnson Newport's 1991 article, right? So if you wanted to defend this position, what you would do is you would go into these articles and you would say, this evidence that you have put forth is irrefutable or hard to refute or whatever, is strong. And people do sometimes, right? And you would say that therefore you can't be native-like. Now, when we talk about subjacency, I'm just going to give you a sense of what that means. Within syntax, subjacency is a kind of a broad term. It's but it's something famously difficult, including in Chinese, which is what Johnson-Newport 91 tested. Subjacency limits movement within a tree. And if you haven't taken syntax, don't worry. You don't need to know what subjacency is specifically, but a couple of you certainly have or are current learning assistants or so on and so forth. And I'm just going to mention now what it is. But subjacency limits movement to local positions. So it could be blocked by a filled specifier or from being inside of a DP. So whereas I can say, who did Mary think John saw? And we're great cyclically, right? In 2, who did John ask when fixed the car? You have a filled specifier. So you can't get up into that top position. Whereas in 3, for example, you're within a DP and you can't get out either, right? So subjacency is this blocking of movement, particularly in WH movement. If you're curious, this is the structure. Pause it and look at it if you're one of the people who cares. Okay. Position 2, learners can be native-like. So similarly to the no position, the kind of people who argue, yes, you can be native-like, go and find studies that concluded this, right? So what they do is they find studies with examples of target-like phonology. So whereas Fluggy et al. Said that they found people that did not have native-like phonology, Bonnegartz et al. 95 says, but we do. Okay. Similarly, Birdsong 92 actually went in and looked at subjacency, but also morphology. And his name's David, so he's a dude. Bonnegartz, I have no idea. But David Birdsong in 92 found the same kind of learners as Johnson-Newport 1991 with a slightly different testing or slightly higher proficiency did in fact behave like native with regards to these things. So a lot of times these articles are in dialogue with one another. So for example, Fluggy et al. Is responding to Bonnegartz and said, you know what? You didn't test this exhaustively. There's more evidence that you're not having target-like phonology than you are. Whereas Birdsong is responding to Johnson-Newport and saying, you didn't test the right people. It is possible to be, right? And White and Genesee in particular looked along a range of first language, so a range of L1s, which is to mean that, like, imagine a whole group of people learning English. Some are native speakers of Chinese, some are native speakers of Spanish, some are native speakers of French, some are native speakers of Russian, whatever. And that a range of these people, in the way it was tested in White and Genesee in 1996, did find evidence of subjacency, knowledge of these blockages of movement. And so as I said, these are in dialogue with one another. And the later studies were not really subsequently refuted. You might want to keep that in mind when you're trying to make a critical assessment of the evidence. Is a lot of times chronology will tell you a lot, because if someone refutes something, it's later. And if no one refutes that person, the evidence is probably pretty good. Okay, just keep that in mind. Not always true, but often. Okay, so finally, position 3. This whole book is pretty much yes, no, and kind of, right? They give you 3 positions for every question pretty much, and it's usually yes, no, or no, yes, and kind of. And so this is the argument that we really have to compare, I would say, to the other 2. This is the one that we have to decide whether we agree with or not. So the claim here is yes, but not in all domains at the same time, okay? In particular, Donna Lardieri has a 2007 book in which she observed that competence can be native-like without performance being native-like. Competence is a technical term, okay? So if you haven't looked it up when you were reading, pause and go look at the glossary of your book, okay? Competence, somewhat like interlanguage, is our mental representation of a language. Competence is what allows us to have an intuition of what is grammatical and ungrammatical in our language. Native speakers have competence, right? Which is to say that I have intuitions about English because I grew up speaking it, okay? I'm a native speaker, I have competence. Now, my competence isn't going to look exactly like someone else's, perchance, right? Not all native speakers have precisely the same intuitions. We just agree enough to say that we all speak the same language, right? So if we're all speakers of English, our mental representations, our competence. Now notice how that word doesn't it's not intuitive at usage, right? It's a technical term. So try to separate out what you're used to the word competence meaning and its technical definition. It is very, very important not to get sucked into your natural sensation. Oh, competence means you're good at something. It's not what it means in linguistics, okay? Competence is your mental representation that gives you intuitions, okay? Um, so anyway, so the overlapping things in our competence between us and other native speakers of a given language is what we call that language, right? So to the extent that we agree on intuitions and what we call English is what English is. This is how we come to the concept of interlanguage. If you recall back when we were talking about, all right, now it's escaping me. I know his name. Selinker, Larry Selinker. He had proposed interlanguage exists for L2 speakers, and that is to say that L2 speakers have intuitions about the language that they're learning. Now, this comes a lot later, but the prediction that we have an internal system in a second language is an offshoot of competence, because we assume all native speakers have competence. And so L2 learners are developing this. They have an ongoing linguistic system that is malleable. Right? So again, technical terms are not what they sound like. They have meanings that are specific, and it's your job to get used to this, okay? So Lardieri claims, or observed really, that competence can be native-like without performance being native-like. Now, performance is pretty much what it sounds like. It is the online use of language. It is subject to errors, even with native speakers. You know, I speak English and I say things wrong occasionally, you know, because I'm human. That's what happens. So these two things can be misaligned. In particular, this book that I'm referencing here, Lardieri 2000, is a case study. Okay, it's about one person, one participant. And the reason why it's one person is because instead of being a lot of people at one time, it's one person over time, right? It's longitudinal. Let's just say one person or one small group over time. It's a very important kind of data, and it actually is rare, because it takes a lot of buy-in from the participant to get longitudinal data. So it's nice when we get it. So Lardieri actually studied a friend of hers. This particular person was an L1 trilingual, right? Notice that when I say L2, I mean a language from outside of the home, which is how this person has 3 L1s. Okay, L1 is a language in the home. L2 is a language outside. So this person spoke Mandarin, Hokkien, I think is how that's said, and Indonesian from essentially birth, right? From where they were from. And I think she was Indonesian, the actual person, and they learned Mandarin there too. But the person was developing an interlanguage of English, okay? And this person lived in the United States for a long time, and the recordings were made, as I said, over time, between like 10 and 20 years. The participant's name is Patty in the book. It's not that person's real name. And the person had inconsistent gaps in producing English morphology, right? So Patty was inconsistent on, let's say, putting the ed of past tense. So sometimes she said walked, and sometimes she said walk. Sometimes she said John runs with the S on the end. The phone is obviously a Z. And sometimes she says John run. Okay, she's inconsistent. But that's performance, right? The argument that Lardieri makes is that in actuality, Patty knew more, because in writing, when she had more time, there was no time pressure, she wasn't pushed to do things, you know, with using more of her online processing. She improved, right? She was a stronger writer than she was a speaker. And the argument Lardieri makes is that that's because Patty didn't have time to use all of her knowledge in speech that she actually knew. And so the proposal is there's a gap between her competence and her production and her performance, okay? And this is something that I think a lot of L2s experience, is that our writing could be one thing, but our actual production is another. Does that make sense? So this is one of those things where, in theory, our competence and our performance can be different. Patty additionally was better at some parts of language than others, some domains, also known as some modules. In particular, she was better at morphosyntax, which we've already said there were some problems, right? Like the ED. Than she was at pragmatics, right? Pragmatics is one of the very last things we learn. It's very contextual, and it's not necessary in day-to-day life. you get less evidence on it. It's just one of those things that kind of lives at the very end of our acquisitional trajectory. And so as a result, Patty was good at some things and less good at others. At the very end, there's a case, this ends up being a case of apparent fossilization, where acquisition halts at a non-target state. Okay. And so what we kind of claim from this is that Lardiere found that so for example, in the cases where you're looking at particular parts, right, domains, you know, there was a difference in how good they were. So potentially, for example, if Patty mastered morphosyntax, let's imagine that happened, she wouldn't necessarily ever master pragmatics. So even if we find evidence of morphosyntax mastery for some reason, it doesn't mean everything's mastered. So this should be evidence for, yes, you could in theory become native-like if we find someone with evidence of morphosyntax like Birdsong did, but we wouldn't assume it happens in all domains at the same time. So Antonella Sirace in 2003 proposed something called residual optionality, which is another claim of not in all domains at the same time. She points out that native speakers have multiple ways sometimes of expressing one idea, right? So for example, I as a native speaker could say, John thinks that Mary is intelligent. But I could technically say, if I really wanted to, John believes that Mary is intelligent. I could technically say John believes Mary to be intelligent. And a couple people are going, But I mean, it's not actually a completely terrible sentence, because John believes Mary to be intelligent is better than John believes Mary to run a mile. John believes Mary to be intelligent. John believes Mary to run a mile. It's not, John believes Mary to be intelligent is not a complete disaster of a sentence. But we don't particularly like it. You know, we'd prefer to say John believes that Mary's intelligent, right? We prefer something like that. So we have multiple ways of saying things. But as Sirace observed, native speakers have tendency to do one or the other with higher frequency. And so when non-native speakers acquire multiple ways to do something, often what you find is that their tendencies don't converge on native speakers. So let's imagine someone comes from a language where John believes Mary to be intelligent is roughly the equivalent of what they do in their first language, right? To be intelligent rather than that is intelligent. And they learn you can technically do both. And so they'll start using the one that's more like their own language, even though the other one is more like a native speaker, or they'll use them both interchangeably, right? So this definitely happens. It's called residual optionality. Then rather than settling on the native-like option, they'll continue using both, or they'll use the wrong one. But usually it's both that they use. Here's an example famously from Italian. And my Italian is basically Spanish with some sounds shoved into it. But let's pretend, for example, right? So here we see a sentence where it says perché, which is because, pensava, she thought, these of, trovarti is trovar is to find, T is you, a casa, at home, right? Compare that to the thing after the slash. Perché lei pensava, lei is she. So she isn't actually said in the first half, but she is said in the second half. The thing is that the native speakers prefer the first one, right? But you can technically do both for slightly different reasons. And non-natives will use either kind of as desired. They don't have the right intuitions about which one is more normal usually, right? Another one you see in this case is, and these are from Sirace, because like I said, she's Italian. But you could say, to say Paola has called or telephoned. Paola has called. You can say ha telefonato Paola or Paola telefonato, right? Both of these are options. And ha telefonato Paola, I think, is actually slightly more typical in Italian, but you can say both. And so a non-native would use both, okay? And you're asking me, okay, I don't understand how this is not in all domains at the same time. What I'm saying is that people that can use both things in most contexts can kind of seem native. So let's imagine we have someone who's really good at Italian and their phonology is more or less right, their semantics are more or less right, their morphology is more or less right, you know, their word orders are more or less right, but then they end up with these options, right? And they don't completely master which one is the most normal, you know? It just, the idea is basically you can become native like, just you can't perfect it, right? And this bucket, not in all domains at the same time, has this sort of not, you can't perfect things, or it's kind of here but not in here. What's actually happening is sort of is a processing thing going on here in number one, right? Having the overt she changes the meaning ever so slightly. It's like a pragmatic processing kind of thing, and so actually it might actually be as strict as semantics, but whatever. But it changes the meaning just very so slightly, and so you're missing that little extra bit of meaning, right? And so that's what we haven't quite mastered. It's, yes, we're very native-like, except we're missing these little things on the edges. Okay. These are the native speaker options, as I said. And then the non-native speakers either use both or they converge on the wrong one. Notice that the red ones here, the second one and 1 and 2, are like English. So if you test English speakers learning Italian, that's what you're often going to see. Okay, so here's the assessment from our authors. The authors point out that many researchers have concluded that learners can be native-like, right? There's been a lot of evidence to say, hey, in a lot of ways, you really can be like natives. But often, this has to come with the caveat of either not quite, or it doesn't extend as evenly across all the domains of language at the same time. Phonology is notoriously challenging. Some people who are really good morphosyntactically still remain with some phonological problems, right? Or, as I said, pragmatics is very, 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 very late acquired, if at all. Okay, so often they don't become so in all the domains. So we do see evidence that native-like is possible, but most people don't really achieve it in the end. I mean, this is true. If you talk to people, not a lot of people reach a proficiency that we would describe as native-like. And we have to kind of revisit that question, right? Is it because it's hard to do it in all the things at once? Is it because of another factor? Is it because, I don't know. I mean, I have ideas, but at this particular point, we don't have any evidence that can answer this question. Okay, I have opinions, but at the moment, not extremely important. But so that's really the kind of thing we have to keep in mind, okay? Is that we see evidence of native likeness, it's not that common, and it doesn't typically tend to be across the board, okay? So the authors conclude this is assuming support for yes, but not in all domains, okay? And thus they do remind us that there's difficulty defining native likeness. I could say, for example, as I did at the beginning, that if I were to test you on a test and compare you to a native speaker, would you perform the same? Is one definition of native likeness. But I mean, the truth is that, like I said, that's only one definition, you know. If you, so if I like microscope in on your performance and you deviate from a native speaker, does that make you non-native like? Or if you walk down the street and most people can't tell, does that make you native like? But what if that same person who walks down the street and isn't really picked out as being non-native, if you look at them under a microscope, doesn't look native? Does that mean they're non-native like? I mean, those are the questions that we're kind of left with, essentially, okay? So we can function in this class as if performing on a test like a native is native-like, but I caution you to assume that that is conclusively true, okay? Or caution you against assuming that that's evidently true, okay? Okay, so in this, like I said, there's a yes, there's a no, there's a yes but not in all domains. The authors argue for yes but not in all domains. Okay, here's the works cited. See you in class.